morning. I'm happy to be here. Pennsylvania Lumbermen's has been a big supporter and member of NHLA for over 20 years. And I'm here today to introduce your keynote speaker, Mike Snow. Mike has been at the helm of the American Hardwood Export Council since 1999. In his role, he leads AHEC's global promotional initiatives and oversees the organization's international offices and teams in Europe, Mexico, Japan, Singapore, India, Hong Kong, and China. Mike has earned his master's degree in international economics from George Washington University and holds a BA in developmental economics from the University of Wisconsin. Before joining AHEC, Mike worked as a consultant specializing in international education and travel programs for renowned institutions like the National Geographic Society and the Smithsonian Association. He has spent several years in Seville, Spain, where he taught economics in both English and Spanish for the University of Wisconsin systems. And most of us in the room are old enough to remember the old E.F. Hutton commercials. Well, I will tell you that E.F. Hutton doesn't have anything on Mike. So please welcome your keynote speaker, Mike Snow.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I'd like to invite up on the stage with me, we have two additional speakers today, and actually what we're going to discuss is going to get a little bit technical. I know a lot of you have heard quite a bit about the EU deforestation regulation that's going to have implications beyond just our exports to Europe. It's going to have global implications, and it's going to require a technical response and a technical solution. So in other words, it's going to require some people that are much smarter than I am. So I'd like to bring them up on stage. First, we have Rupert Oliver. Many of you know Rupert. He is an environmental consultant. He's been working with AHEC for about 25 years now, but he's also worked with clients such as the UN Timber Committee and the International Tropical Timber Organization, and I think he's one of the most knowledgeable people when it comes to the international policy environment, particularly for environmental regulations. And also next to us is Phil Guillery. Phil has been in the hardwood industry for more than 30 years. He's a fellow, he's a forester, fellow Wisconsin Badger. But Phil was also, for many years, he was one of the founders of the FSC in the United States. He served as the Director of Supply Chain Integrity for FSC in the United States and for many years, and he was also the founding director of the World Forest ID program. So what I'm going to do here basically is I'm going to give just a very brief update on where we stand right now on international markets for the first half of the year. It's not a pretty picture, which I know will come as no surprise to any of you here in the room, but I really think that we need to focus on, we have the real potential to have major disruptions in global trade and timber coming up over the next year. So I would like to discuss that, and I'll begin very quickly with some good news. We are still the largest hardwood exporter in the world. Exports represent about 25% of our grade lumber production. About 18% of our total lumber production are going to the exports. We'd like to see that number grow. We know that most of our customers are overseas. Most consumers in the world are overseas. We also have, when you're looking at the other side of that, China remains the largest hardwood importer in the world. And this slide shows imports from everywhere, not just from the United States. So this is total imports of hardwood lumber, both tempered and tropical, from all worlds. You can see a big drop in China over the last couple of years. But there's also some of there on this board that may surprise you as being some of the world's largest importers. You look, for example, down here, countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like India, where we have very little market penetration to U.S. hardwoods. These are major lumber importers, and this is something that we've been working on very hard. We have all of our overseas directors are here, or most of our overseas directors are here. We do have one that is having a medical issue, so is not here. But Rod Wiles, I know many of you know, is running the programs for India and the Middle East. If you have a chance to talk to him, I advise you to do that because he's very, very knowledgeable in those markets. You'll notice also the EU 27 being our second largest market, or being the second largest importer worldwide. And this is one of the reasons why what's going on with the EU deforestation regulation is of such concern. And I would really like to point out that what we're talking about here today is one part of our response, of AHEC's response. But this is just one part of a much wider communication strategy where we're communicating not only with the architects and the designers and the manufacturers around the world, but also reaching out to the press. We will be having a couple of press missions focusing on some of the major European press. We're going to bring them over to our forests. We're going to let them talk to individual landowners. We're going to let them talk to the communities that are dependent on the forest and discuss why the regulation that was proposed does create such a problem for our industry. And I would really like to thank David Venables, who runs our European office. He really is a driving force behind our environmental strategy, working very closely with Rupert. He does have a crack team of people with him in London. I would personally like to thank them for their leadership on these issues. We look now, this is US exports and our largest markets. And of course, if we're looking at the first half, this is for the first half of this year, and we're seeing across the board in almost every single market, we're seeing a lower first half of this year compared to the first half of last year. There's a lot of reasons for that. For time constraints, I'm not going to go into each individual market, although we will be having a statistical update webinar in the next couple of weeks, so be on the lookout for the invitation for that, where we'll go into much more detail. Hate to put this slide up because it is a very depressing slide, but I think it's an important slide to look at. Hopefully, we're hitting in most of these overseas markets, we're hitting the bottom. I think China still has a ways to fall. I'm not very optimistic at all of even the medium-term potential to see a whole lot of growth in China, but it still remains the largest market, and it's something that we still need to work on, and I know John Chan and his team are working very hard now that we can go back into China. We just had our convention last month for the first time since before COVID. Things are beginning to open back up. But the Chinese economy, to be quite frank, is in disarray, in particular the housing markets. And that obviously was a major portion of where our lumber went when it went into China. One thing that is changing and has been changing that we want to get into, and really the focus of this session today, is that the policy environment has been changing. It's been changing for about the last 10 years. Before 2012, we really didn't face any regulatory, I don't want to say barriers to trade, but at least regulatory requirements for due diligence, for demonstration of legality, until the Australians passed the first Illegal Logging Act in 2012, followed by the European Timber Regulation. And as you've seen over the rest of the years now, a big chunk of all of our overseas markets are now require some type of legality verification, sustainability verification, and I think that movement is only going to grow. That's why last year, those of you who were here, we introduced what we're calling the Sustainable Hardwood Coalition. It's an attempt to create a jurisdictional-based certification system. In other words, all of the small holders within a jurisdiction, in our case, in the United States, it would be the states. We started originally looking at sustainability standards and then chain of custody standards. However, as we got into this process this year, something happened that really pulled the rug out from under us and has made us look at a complete rethink of our strategy. And what that was the introduction of the European Union Deforestation Regulation, or EUDR. Most aspects of this regulation, I think, are good. They finally recognizes that deforestation is not coming from the timber industry, and it focuses on deforestation from other agricultural products, from everything from the palm oil plantations in Indonesia that are replacing natural forests. We're seeing deforestation in places like Brazil. There's been too much focus in the EU and elsewhere on timber regulations when actually what's driving the vast majority of deforestation around the world is agriculture. And I think this was a good step in the right direction. The problem was the execution was carried out in such a way that it really is going to make it difficult, and I'm going to let the technical experts get into it a little bit more than I do, but the main issue that we face as an industry is that whether the U.S. is low risk, indeterminate risk, or high risk, all exports of not just hardwood, not just lumber, but coffee, soybeans, cattle, a couple of other agricultural products are now going to have to be shown the provenance where that wood came from, but down to the individual landowner, the individual real estate owner, for each piece of land, for each piece of timber in every consignment delivered to Europe. I don't have to tell you the difficulty that is for a fragmented supply chain like we have in this industry. The small landowners, the millions and millions of small private landowners where we procure our timber, not to mention the small family-owned sawmills that dominate in our industry. This is creating quite a difficult barrier to trade. I'm going to turn it over now to Rupert to talk in a little bit more detail on this and what we have done so far moving forward and how we think we can address this, because I think we may have found a solution for the industry, and I'm going to let Rupert and Phil talk to you about that. Thank you.
Oh.
I'm sorry. I did have one more slide. One of the things that's an important part about the World Forest ID, as I mentioned, it's not just shipping timber and raw timber, but it also includes wood products made anywhere in the world going into Europe. So we have a situation, for example, any wood that you ship to, say, Turkey or to Vietnam or to China that gets turned into a wood product, a piece of furniture, flooring, whatever it is, that wood then has to be traced back to where the tree was actually grown with each consignment. And you can imagine how difficult that's going to get when you start talking about finished products. This was very interesting. We went to the World Forest ID in Kew Gardens in London, and I don't want to get into too many details other than this is a table leg that was taken from a table that was imported into the UK from China. And what the customs authorities in the UK wanted was for the Kew Gardens, for the World Forest ID, to identify the wood in that table leg. And what they identified was actually 17 different species of wood in that one table leg. So you can imagine how complicated this regulation is going to be if they're going to expect to have access to the provenance of every single piece of every single wood product coming into the European Union. So with that, now I will turn it over to Rupert.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, Mike's already summarized to some extent exactly what the situation is. We were obviously evolving this Sustainable Hardwood Coalition Certification Program, which was designed to deliver a certified sustainable claim. However, obviously to do that and deliver on that can take quite a lot of time. It takes quite a lot of time to build consensus around sustainability standards. And actually, time is one thing we do not have with the EU deforestation regulation. We have to deliver an assurance that meets their requirements before the end of next year. So this really argues very strongly for a phased approach to the implementation of these systems. So the first phase is very much focused on the development of a set of procedures that can deliver against the deforestation regulation. In fact, we're quite confident. We're quite confident Phil is going to set out the parameters of a technical solution that we think could work without adding costs to the industry, which very much exploits some of the very strong advantages of the hardwood industry. The fact that it is climate positive, that term we heard yesterday at the workshop, it's a very powerful term. It's something that we can exploit, and also deforestation free. And we can use high-tech solutions to demonstrate that American hardwoods are deforestation free. And depending on the level of acceptance of that claim in the marketplace, we can perhaps use that to roll out the second phase, which is the sustainability certification program, or perhaps we might not need to go any further down that road. We might have a claim that we can use in the global marketplace, which is very powerful and which satisfies the vast majority of the greenest markets in the world. Yeah, the EU deforestation regulation, I'm not going to talk in any detail about this. I'll leave that to Phil. He has actually been doing a lot of work on this for us. I would just emphasize again what Mike said. It really is, this law really is a mix of the good, the bad, and the ugly from a US hardwood perspective. One of the good things, I know Mike mentioned some of the good things, one of the good things it does do is actually encourage new innovative approaches to demonstrating deforestation-free products. And we initially thought that there was very little scope for the US hardwood industry to comply with things like the geolocation requirement because of the amount of mixing, the complexities of demonstrating supply to origin to a specific real estate property, and the amount of mixing that goes on was going to make that impossible. But we think, as I say, we think we have a solution. The ugly aspects of this law are a lot of things that might conflict with the WTO regulations. And actually, this law could well be challenged in the WTO within a matter of months, which would mean, actually, it would probably be quite a long, drawn-out process. And we fully expect all the requirements to be implemented as of the end of next year. But longer term, there might be changes to this regulation which do raise some uncertainties. We have been very much engaged with European trade associations, with the US mission in Brussels, raising these issues. I have to emphasize, though, up until now, there's been quite a difficult political environment to push our case. In fact, the EU has done very little consultation with overseas producers on this. Having said that, though, the EU is now in a position where it's having to implement this, it's having to find solutions, and essentially our case is, if you cannot demonstrate conformance to this law for a product like American hardwood, which is probably the most climate-positive product on the planet, if you can't demonstrate it for that, how are you going to achieve it for other products? Cocoa, chocolate, palm oil, these have massive problems of compliance, and we are going to demonstrate to them that you can make this work for our product. We want to be on the right side of this law, ultimately. I won't go into more detail, or that we could perhaps cover that in more detail during the question and answer session. But I would just like now to introduce Phil Guillery, who was commissioned as of May this year. In fact, before the law was even enforced, we could see where this was heading, so we commissioned some independent research by Phil Guillery and Associates to try and identify, really, are there any technological solutions to this problem that we have with the geolocation requirements? I have to say that when we first employed Phil, we didn't think he'd find an answer. We didn't think it would be possible. However, Phil has surprised us. He's come up with something which we think might work. Phil's also looking at the WTO implications, and he can comment a little bit more about that. And also, of course, to advise us on how we take forward the Sustainable Hardwood Coalition certification program. And with that, I think I will hand over to Phil. There might be a brief lull while we change the slides, but Phil, please. Is it on the same? Oh, it is on the same slide. Yeah.
Thank you. No, thank you, Rupert. And yes, so I was asked by AHEC and Mike if I would be willing and interested to look at the EUDR regulations and see if there was anything that could be done. I think I would tend to agree with Rupert, the good, the bad, the ugly. And so looking at it, I think I'm an optimistic person, so felt like, well, I don't know. I tend to agree with Mike and Rupert that this is going to be a very hard regulation for U.S. producers to be able to meet. but let's see. I mean, let's at least examine it, see what those hurdles are. So if nothing else, AHEC and the industry can go to the Europeans and saying, this is really unreasonable. There's, these hurdles are, so high, it's going to have cost implications that make it impossible to meet. And we wouldn't be able to sell anymore to Europe. But I thought, well, let's have an open mind and let's look and see let's look at the regulation, really carefully look at the regulation, and then look at, are there ways that possibly that this regulation could be met? What would be those hurdles? What would be those costs? And then look at that objectively and make an analysis. So quickly, I guess the bad, the ugly is the EUDR. And I think I'm going to go into some of the details. Hopefully your eyes won't glaze over, but I think they're really important to understand. There's some of these slides are going to have a lot of text. I think they'll be made available, but I just wanted to make sure that all of the details, as much as possible, you understand the details of this regulation, and then that helps us understand what are the possible solutions to it. So I think some of the really key aspects of the EUDR, as I think is, I tend to agree with what the outcome they are looking for. And I think I really, as a forester and who's worked internationally, was, very glad that they are expanding it to the real causes of deforestation, which is agriculture. So the commodities, so cattle, soy, palm oil, cocoa, coffee, and rubber are now all as well have to meet this regulation. And that's new, because before it was EU timber regulation and it was only timber, and timber is not the main driver of deforestation. So that's a good thing that is happening. Some of the things that I think are important to understand is they say that this is starting in December 30th, 2024. Actually, it's starting now, because what they're saying is any product that goes into Europe starting December 30th, 2024 must meet the regulation. But that counts for anything harvested when the law was implemented in 2023. So what that means is if someone selling some hardwoods to, say, to China that's being made into a couch, and that couch then goes in December 2024, if that wood was harvested after 2023, they have to be able to supply that information that it's legal and it's deforestation free. So some of the things that are required is, and that needs to be very clear, is that whoever's placing a product into the European market, they call them an operator. Any operator, that means it is taking a product, so American hardwoods that are exported to Europe and then placed on the market, who's going to sell it into the European market must comply with the regulation. And some of that is that there's a due diligence process that they have to go through. So they have to create a due diligence system that basically says that this product is deforestation free and meets legality requirements as outlined in the law. So, and I think the important part is the penalties are very severe for the EUDR. So those who are placing, those operators who are placing products into the market are going to take this regulation very seriously, because you can see 4% of your turnover of your is quite large penalty, some exclusion from public procurement. So there's some major penalties. Another important part of the EUDR is it's also for anything that's going traded within the European market. So it's not only so European hardwood producers also have to comply with this law in Europe if they're selling into Europe or exporting out of Europe. So it's also, the European industry is as much of a panic about this as the overseas industries and the US industries. So this regulation is broken down into two areas: legality requirements and the geolocation requirement. So I'm going to talk quickly about both of those. So the legality requirements so they go into detail what that means. So are you following the environmental protection laws, forest-related rules on harvesting, equipment use, third-party rights, that means customary rights of people in the community. Do they have access to the forest? If they have access to the forest for hunting and other things, are those laws clearly written and enforced? Human rights protected under the international laws, so things like child labor and issues like that. And then free prior informed consent of indigenous people. Do they have those rights on their lands to have free prior informed consent on how it's managed? And then any anti-corruption and compliance. So a very broad range of and they very clearly define legality. Then the other one, which is the one that I think is quite ambitious for the Europeans, and especially when you look at all the different commodities for cocoa and coffee that are often produced by small holders of maybe an acre or less, that the geolocation of the land down to the real estate property must be provided with the shipment. Whoever's bringing it into Europe has to have all of those geolocations and provide that to the EU. And that is in the range of when that product was produced, the harvest dates from when the harvest could have started to when it could have ended. So some of the things that's really critical and seem to be a big challenge for the US industry is these geospatial requirements, because what they define it as? It's the real estate property. So it's not insensitive. You can't use a jurisdictional approach and say, well, in this county, we're going to say in this county is where this wood is harvested. No, it gets down to the real estate property, which, as all of you know, can be very, very small in the US. And it's the owner and how that's defined legally in the county, state, and the country. So then on top of that, you have to supply the boundary data for that real estate property. So if it's a 40 hectare or 40 acre plot of forest, you have to say, that you have to supply the boundaries of that property down to what they say is 6 digits longitude and latitude. So what does that mean? That's about within the accuracy of 2 centimeters. So the boundary of that land down to an accuracy of 2 centimeters. So very precise, they expect that, and down to 4 hectares. So you have to have the boundaries down to about 10 acres. That's a big challenge. So we have these regulations. So the question I was asked, can US producers meet these regulations, and what would be the hurdles to meet them? So went about looking at it. So it's legality and this geolocation. Can it be done? Seems pretty difficult when we were looking at it. So how could this be done? Legality, I think, is reasonably straightforward. I think the US industry is in pretty good shape. AHEC's done a lot of work to be able to show the legality and demonstrate the legality of US hardwoods. And it's basically following a risk assessment approach. So the idea is that you have to show that there's a negligible risk that the products are coming from illegal sources. So, and this is where, so for example, the US AHEC has done the Seneca Creek assessment showing lawful sourcing and sustainability of US hardwoods that I think has been recognized and well accepted. In a sense of it's probably starting to get out of date. Another thing that's interesting is with this on how they are defining legality areas is the Forest Stewardship Council. Corresponds very closely with how FSC defines legality in regards to controlled wood. So the FSC Control Wood National Risk Assessment is a really useful document because it looks at legality and deforestation across the US in very, very fine detail. And then Rupert talked also about the Sustainable Hardwoods Coalition looking at doing more, showing legality down to the state level for this 33 hardwood producing states. So, well, I'll quickly go through this. The US National Risk Assessment basically it looked at across the US in great detail in a multi-stakeholder process with industry, with environmental groups, with government, many, many participants. And they looked at these 5 categories. The 3 ones that are significant for the EUDR is the illegal harvesting of wood, wood harvested in violation of traditional rights, and wood harvested from plantations or deforestation. So, and what was interesting is the National Risk Association assessment. So this is something that you, if you're exporting to Europe, would be able to use and reference this, is they found illegally harvested wood is a negligible risk. They say low risk, but they say it's equivalent. The FSC is also concerned about making sure any FSC wood meets EU deforestation regulations. So it's something that's actually being done for the industry, and the industry can be used. So basically it's showing that it demonstrates legality. It's, I think, adequate for the European Union. It should be adequate to say the risk of illegality is negligible for all of the US. And then what about converting from forests to plantations or to agriculture? So one of the things, and I think I didn't say, mention this, is really interesting about the EU deforestation regulation, and it seems at first a little bit puzzling, is they say they define deforestation as any change of forest to agriculture. They do not, that's all they care about. So if it's deforestation from forest to urban, that doesn't count as deforestation for the EUDR. It's only to agriculture. And that's, I think, significant. So the other thing is Rupert talked about the risk assessment they will be conducting, and I think that will also help provide the legality. So then this idea of deforestation, and can you, is deforestation something prevalent, or is it a negligible risk here in the US? So this is the FSC did an analysis, a very detailed analysis of all counties in the US. This shows the ones where there is a non-negligible risk or non-low risk of deforestation. And these are the counties. It's only, I think, 50 counties out of 3,000 in the US, so quite rare. But the other thing is the risk of conversion for all of these gray counties is to urban. It's not to agriculture. When you look at conversion to agriculture, that is a very, you all would know, is that it's not something, it's not a common practice anymore. Most forests are most agriculture land's going to forests, not the other way around. And the same with hardwood forests going to things like plantations. That's becoming a more rare and rare process. So then let's move to the geolocation. So you have to provide this information of the boundaries of all of the properties for a product. And and I think I emphasized any deforestation. It's every single, so if there's one 10-acre plot, if it's gone from forest to non-forest, and that's just, a very, very, one of thousands, that's enough to say you haven't met that regulation. That reject that. The European Union's, the competent authorities could reject that shipment, and there could be penalties for just a single piece of deforestation, even if it was a very, very small percentage. They don't have any, it's not, it's basically everything must qualify. So how could you do this? I mean, part of it was thinking this really is almost, basically impossible, or if it's possible, it would be incredibly expensive. You would have to find every landowner that was going into a harvest and find and confirm it was not deforestation. You would need to get the boundaries from the landowner. How is a sawmill going to do that? So we looked at this and came up with a possible solution thanks to a hunting app, which I'll explain, which gave us an idea of how to do this. So one of the things is, how would you go about this? So we sort of said, how could you do this if you had the data? Let's just assume we can get the data. So you have to be able to identify deforestation or forest degradation. Well, so the steps on this is that you would have to get information, a technical solution. You would have to get the remote sensing data, the satellite imagery, to be able to actually look. Can you look from 20 to 2021 over a year period and see if deforestation occurred? Well, there's a lot of satellite imagery available, so that's, and a lot of it's free from the US government, so that's possible. You can get the data, and then can you classify the data as saying, is it forest or non-forest? So there's well-established field in GIS and remote sensing that has for many years been working on doing that level of analysis, saying, can you identify if a forest, if it's a hardwood forest, it's a softwood forest, if it's a soy field, that can all be done using current data acquisitions. And you can actually, the level of detail to say you can actually look at forests and forest change in very, very fine areas. So then, can you then detect where there is forest loss going from hardwood forest to agriculture? Again, something that would be very rare and not very common. So one of the things is there's a number of companies that do this, that actually provide this and can do it using remote sensing data, satellite imagery, plus using satellite imagery, and then using things like machine learning, artificial intelligence to be able to actually identify these land changes and flag those properties that are being changed. Planet Labs is a company that sent up hundreds and hundreds of shoebox-sized satellites, and they can give you every day they can give you a new image of any piece of land in the world up to 5-meter resolution. So basically, they can look and see if your backyard, you could identify if there was a jungle gym, or what's happening in your backyard, if there's a picnic bench. I mean, the resolution is unbelievable. If you've seen pictures of the war in Ukraine, a lot of those images you see are from Planet Labs. Well, that's available. That's available for purchase, and basically at those kind of resolutions. So then the real question is, well, how do you get the boundaries? How are you going to get the boundaries down to 2-centimeter accuracy? And this is where we went and looked at how do you get those boundaries? And at the accuracy level, it seemed like that's going to be impossible. You need to have all of them. You can't just have some of them. You need to have all of them. But then someone told me, and I'm guessing some of you have heard of OnX. If you haven't, I think definitely look it up. It's an amazing app. It's a hunting app. And I had a friend tell me, it's like, well, what you're trying to do is just like what OnX. And if you want the boundaries, you can find, OnX has the boundaries for, basically all the lands and ownerships for the US. So this is an OnX map here in Kentucky, and you can see there, they have the boundaries, the landowner boundaries, and labeled, if it's public, if it's state, if it's county, if it's private, and then who owns it. And they have all of this information available, and map that you can use and for hunters to use so they can know where they can go hunt and make planning for hunt. You can look and you can do certain things saying, oh, can I see the deciduous forests or the hardwood forests, softwood forests, all these things that as a hunter you'd be interested in, young aspen forests for grouse hunters and things like that. It can all be mapped. So what that means is that the property boundaries are available, and the company that supplies that to OnX is called Regrid. They have 99.9% of the ownerships of the US and their boundaries available. And I told you it had to be for the Europeans a resolution of 2 centimeters. They have it down to less than 2 centimeters. And every single property in the country is available with the ownership information because they went and got all of the county records for all of the tax records for all lands of the United States, and then they digitized it and put it into something equivalent to Zillow for land. So then that's the critical piece, is that in the US, you can get every single piece of real estate property and the boundaries of it to the extent that's needed by the EU. So then what can you do? How could this work without being a huge burden for a sawmill or an exporter? So the solution is to then basically map out find all of the hardwood forests and have you can have on the base the property and the real estate property boundaries. Find the ones that are hardwood forests, which can be done with current remote sensing and satellite data quite easily. From that, find out which ones have had canopy change. The satellite imagery can tell you if they can go down to the level of saying if there's one tree removed, one change in the canopy, they can detect that. So detect all hardwood forests that have changed over the last year and use that as a proxy for harvest. So then you have a smaller subset of possible lands. Okay, of those, look at the ones that went from hardwood forest to agriculture. So probably bare soil or pasture. There's going to be very few of them. Find those. And then you take the set that isn't agriculture, you pull out the red ones and all of these blue ones, you would then download. So the way the system would work is, for example, if you were an exporter or a sawmill, or you were an exporter and you say, I buy from these 4 sawmills, you would then say, okay, for that sawmill, where's their wood basket? And you could draw a radius of 150 miles. You might know what counties that they draw from, saying, okay, here are the pick list, you pick some number of counties, and then from those counties, it would automatically give you these polygons, these properties where the harvest could have occurred over the last year, and making sure then you would need to confirm that the product didn't come from those forests that were cleared and converted. And so there'd probably be a need of a system to be able to go confirm that, but that could be, the system does that, that would be produced. And then, so you would check those, you would check the ones that come out red. We think they're very few because there are so little deforestation to agriculture in this country. And so then this is just quickly, I think we're running out of time. So it can be done at different levels. So you do it at 3 different levels. More and more, as you get to finer and finer resolution of the satellite imagery, you have to pay money. So you'd wait to do that. But you would likely be able to, and then use ground truthing to verify the results. So this is just a preliminary, quick, working with the American Green, a consulting company I've partnered with on this is the green. This is North Carolina, which probably has the most potential deforestation to agriculture. So we chose North Carolina in the country. But as you see, you can't see the red dots, but there aren't, it's not very clear here, but there aren't many. The blue is agriculture lands, but not recently converted, not over the last year, and the green is forest cover. So you're going to get probably very little conversion. So it's going to be, and then the system would be basically going into, you would map out where in North Carolina you bought from, and it would automatically give you those polygons. So then how would this be done? Who could do this? Well, there's a number of service providers who already provide these kind of services. Look at OnX. It's an industry, so there's going to be quite a few companies, service providers who could build such a platform for AHEC, for the industry to be able to use, and then something that would be very simple application for anybody who would be exporting to Europe to be able to get the information. You could download the legality review and that information for the area, and you could then download the polygons and not have to do anything, not have to go ask a lot of questions, go collect a lot of information. It would just be through a system such as OnX. The main risks, what might be a challenge, is that the EU needs to accept this. Some people think the EU regulation says that you have to supply the exact locations from where the product was harvested. But there's a number of industries, because it's even more difficult for coffee manufacturers and cocoa manufacturers to do that than hardwood manufacturers to be able to do that. I know Rupert talked to the EU, and they seem to be basically saying that how we're proposing to do this is acceptable. Some of their frequently asked questions say it should be acceptable, but I think the next steps is to actually build a pilot, a prototype, and then show it and demonstrate it. This is how the US industry proposes to do this, and confirm that it's acceptable. It should be acceptable because one of the things, and I think we're running out of time, so I want to do this quickly. What makes this probably acceptable is if you look at the EUDR, is it a trade barrier? Can it be considered a trade barrier? So I worked with some lawyers who have argued in front of the WTO, and they basically say, yes, this is open for a lot of, that they could definitely take this to the, countries could take this to the WTO and they probably would win. And here are some of the reasons. The key finding is one of the things if it's a barrier to trade, a regulation, is if there's simpler, and this is the key one, if there's simpler alternatives to proving that something's deforestation free, they need to accept it. And what we're proposing is a simpler way to do it. It provides as much accuracy and credibility as any other way. So I think it's very strong to be able to say, we can ensure, pretty much guarantee that these products are deforestation free. Here's the boundaries of all the possible properties to the resolution that you request, and that should be adequate. But there's also a lot of other things that are problems with the regulation. I'm not going to go into that, but there are things that can be challenged. I think the recommendation isn't for your association or AHEC to go and get the US government to challenge us with WTO. These lawyers said they're pretty confident in Malaysia, Indonesia, Brazil, because it's going to be a bigger problem for their countries because of palm oil, soy, cattle ranching, that they're likely to do this. And I think is what the US can come is more saying, well, we have a solution. This might be the case, but here's how it can work, and we think we have a good solution. So I think in conclusion, I'm really excited. I'm hoping to continue to work with AHEC on looking at, okay, now we have a feasible way to meet EUDR, and so can we pilot and test it? And I'm hoping, that we would be able to work with some of you to pilot this and test it and make sure it is something easy to use, doesn't create huge costs to be able to implement, and basically you can carry on your practices, because my experience and looking at and having worked in the industry for many years and working with Forest Stewardship Council, is U.S. is deforestation free. It's not where the Europeans are concerned about forests being converted to agriculture. It's not happening in this country. And I think we found a way to really prove that and demonstrate that and meet the regulation. So thank you very much. I know that was a lot of technical, complicated information.
Thanks. Just before we move on to the question and answer, I just want to briefly say what, from an AHEC and Sustainable Hardwood Coalition position, what the next steps are. I mean, the bottom line is there's a lot of detail in there, and it will take time to get your head around it. It took me quite a long time to get my head around it, and I'm sure there's quite a lot of questions there. But from the bottom line is that the US has better data, I think, than any other country on the earth, in the world. The boundary data, for example, I know for a fact there's not a single country that has boundary data that is so readily accessible as there is in the United States. So bottom line is we can leverage this data to provide a claim, a very, very robust claim that wood products are deforestation free. So the next steps from a US hardwood perspective are, well, AHEC is actually at this moment commissioning 33 state risk assessments to cover the EUDR legality requirements, and that the aim is to have those risk assessments done before the end of the first quarter next year. The idea behind this is a bit like an evolution of the Seneca Creek approach. We want to have a set of legality risk assessments that are essentially carried out specifically on US hardwoods and that cover the EUDR legality requirements and are very focused on that. We're also going to be obviously commissioning the GIS experts. Phil mentioned a number of service providers. We'll be looking for bids from those service providers to assess the risk of deforestation and forest degradation using the satellite data, and preparing this in a national database and an app whereby individual plots of land will be defined as EUDR conformant and EUDR non-conformant, and there will be a process, a procedure whereby the individual mills can have access to that data. And then the other thing we're wanting to do, which is actually critically important given that so much American hardwood passes through third countries and is manufactured into furniture in third countries before going into the EU, is to develop a globally applicable chain of custody standard. That will be where, for example, the mitigation actions that are required by individual mills to ensure that non-conformant wood does not enter the supply chain will be identified in that chain of custody standard. We reckon, of course, as Phil said, that the risks actually will be very low. So the mitigation actions should also be relatively easy to comply with. If the risks are extremely low, it could simply be a self-declaration by the mills that they have complied with this requirement. And also, of course, it will have to have a procedure whereby the geolocation data can be amalgamated in a standard format and distributed and passed down the supply chain. We want to integrate this chain of custody standard as much as possible with other certification chain of custody standards and procedures, and to set out rules, for example, for the product claim that will be made with products using this chain of custody standard, which will be something like legal and deforestation free in accordance with EUDR. And we think actually this claim may have profound and useful resonance in the international market. And at the same time, we're just at the moment embarking and revisiting all the market research that we've done on the certification market. We do think that this new law and these new innovative approaches could actually change the whole nature of the discussion around certification, not only in the EU, but in the global market. And we want to begin to explore through new market research, which, as I say, we're embarking on now, exactly what the impact of it will be on the wider market. And we specifically want to assess if market access for US hardwoods in the future is best served by this new type of label, the deforestation-free labeling, or perhaps through the risk-based jurisdictional certification program that we introduced last year, or it could be done through some sort of refinement of the American Hardwood environmental profiling system, which can actually link quite closely with the environmental product declarations. And it's not necessarily an either-or. We might have to do we might have to do all, none or all of these, but we need to have greater information on the way the market is going to evolve. So yeah, that market research will be rolled out over the next 2 or 3 months. Thank you.
And the approach, I know there was an awful lot thrown at you and a lot of it very technical, but essentially this door was opened by the EU in an agreement that they made with the soybean industry, in particular the US soybean industry, whereas the original wording was talking about linking individual consignments to individual landowners. Unlike our customers in Europe, the furniture manufacturers and the flooring manufacturers that we serve in Europe, they seem to be asleep at the wheel. The customers of the soybean industry, which tends to be the European, basically their agricultural groups, their poultry industry, their pork industry, their beef industry, they saw very early the risk that this was going to have for them and for the price of their feedstock. They went to the European Union, something that our customers didn't do, and I think that's one of the reasons that we were a little bit behind the 8 ball starting out. There was no consultation with overseas, and I hate to say it, but I think our counterparts in Europe really were asleep at the wheel and didn't understand the implications of this. I was flabbergasted that when Rupert attended the meeting with CE Bois, which is the association of all the woodworking industries in Europe, which is, again, all the furniture manufacturers, all the woodworking industries. They did not understand, after this was implemented, they did not understand the definition of plot of land being all the way down to an individual landowner. They simply assumed it was a jurisdiction. But by reaching this agreement with the soybean industry, essentially what the EU has said is that you can provide the geolocations for any plot of land, for any polygon from which the wood may have come. You don't necessarily have to link it directly to each individual consignment. That's our interpretation right now, and again, it's going to depend very much on what the European Commission thinks. We feel very strongly that we're going to provide something that nobody else is going to be able to provide. We're going to solve a problem for them because I think they rushed through and enacted this without really thinking through what the implications were. They're going to have some real issues in how they're going to actually how they're going to enforce this regulation. And I think if we can come to the table rather than threatening lawsuits, like the Brazilians and Indonesians are, but we can come to the table with a solution that's going to solve their problem. And we think it's going to fall on, I think, some sympathetic ears within Europe. But what I would also say is all of this and AHEC being able to take on major portions of this and commission the studies, build the prototype, and make this information available to all the sawmills in the U.S., all the hardwood industry in the U.S., depends very much on our continued funding through the Farm Bill. As many of you know, the Farm Bill expired at the end of September. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of movement right now towards renewing the Farm Bill. Technically, our funding is going to expire at the end of December, although there are a couple of contingency plans in place by the USDA. But I would say for those of you that are in contact with your members of Congress, getting that Farm Bill, and in particular the market access program and foreign market development programs that are under that Farm Bill, getting that Farm Bill passed really needs to be a priority, or all of this work could essentially be for nothing. I guess we can open up. We got about 10 minutes. We want to open up to any questions or answers, or questions and hopefully answers. Mm-hmm. I think there really is a potential that if we can get over these hurdles, and we're fairly confident we can, that this can really be a good thing for us moving forward. It can really put the U.S. hardwood industry front and center globally as really being the only ones. I mean, not even the Europeans have the type of data that we have on land ownership and so forth. We can really kind of be front and center. We can be leading the world on this, and I think it's a real opportunity if we can keep pushing on and if we can make this happen. And as I said, as long as our funding continues, we're relatively confident that that this is a workable solution and that we can move forward.
Yeah, just to, is this on? Just to add to that, I think is talking to a lot of my European colleagues and others in the world is when I tell them in the U.S. we have the boundary data for every real estate property in the country. First of all, no one believes it, and when I explain it, then basically the U.S. is way ahead because no other country in the world has 100%, geolocation data digitized, and so I think that will allow the U.S. industry to have a real advantage, and I think that's the thing. Take it, you've got something that no one else has, and use it, and use it to show the sustainability and legality of your product.